on who we are. If you're not familiar with Interface is a global flooring manufacturer. It was founded in 1973 in the state where I currently reside, which is Georgia. And for the first 20 years of our life as a company, we were a typical, competitive interior products company. In the sense that we didn't think very much about sustainability, and by very much I mean really not at all. And then in 1994, our founder Ray Anderson, who passed away in 2011, who Mikhail was fortunate enough to meet and work with, I was not, had an epiphany about the impact of his company on nature, on the environment, and completely changed the trajectory of our work and our business. To address those natural capital concerns right alongside continuing to maintain our status as a competitive business. And so Mikhail and I both work for our sustainability team here in the Americas, and are really the beneficiaries of a tradition and a legacy of environmental leadership at the company that we're going to share some of the experience with, with you all today, and talk hopefully not exclusively about the manufacturing sector or about building products, which is where we live, and try to relate some of our experience to this Scope 3 emissions conversation and kind of action on those emissions. So thank you to Indiana Sustainability and to the group that has put this on for letting us come and speak. Thank you to the presenting sponsors and the Airport Authority, of course. And I just gave a brief little bit of introduction about myself, so I'll turn it over to Mikhail to say hello and introduce himself, and then I'll keep going.
Great. My name is Mikhail. I've been at Interface. I'm the director of technical sustainability, which means if you want to nerd out, let me know. But my world has always been, I did a degree in environmental science in undergrad many, many years ago. Right about the time I graduated, I saw a weird talk by a guy with a funny Southern accent who talked about, how he was an industrialist who realized he'd done everything wrong and was going to try to transform his company. And that was Ray Anderson. So that was my first inkling, which had never before occurred to me that I might someday work for a flooring company. But for me, my whole career trajectory has been how do we pull levers to become more sustainable, whether we're looking at public policy or whether we're looking at education, or I did a lot of consulting with other big companies before coming back to kind of the place I started and thinking about business and sustainability, which is Interface. So fun to be with you there today, really doing what we do, which is to try to influence. Ooh.
We can hear you. You're good.
My screen just changed dramatically, so it's making me worry that something happened. Okay. Anyway, so we're happy to be with you here today, really trying to help other people, continue on this or get started on this journey wherever you are in the sustainability journey, because there's lots of important work to be done, which is why it's fun for us to come to work every day.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess I'll just share very briefly my journey to Interface, because I, like Mikhail, did not grow up thinking that I would want to work for a carpet company. But I came to the sustainability industry pretty convinced of two things. One, that I needed to work for a nonprofit or a charity organization to believe in what I did. And two, that the environmental movement was really bad at creating a movement, because most of what I'd ever been exposed to was the facts and figures and the shameful science and the kind of fear mongering that we really associate with things like, a lot of the climate change research that we've all been familiar with. And so even in college, I wanted to try to find ways to relate environmental and sustainability focused work to the human impact and the kind of benefit and quality of life impacts of taking action. And I now feel grateful that I have a kind of business context where I can pursue that same kind of message and impact while still staying true to, in my opinion, true to kind of deep sustainability action. So today we're going to focus on this Scope 3 emissions topic that the conference wanted us to really address. So the first thing we need to do is really just make sure we're all agreed on what those definitions are. And I'll just take this moment as I'm going through these objectives here to mention, especially because it seems like we have a pretty small group on, we would be happy to be interrupted. So I don't know if you all have the ability to unmute yourselves and speak up, but even if you don't, please use the chat and the Q&A. We'll be looking at both of them. And if there's anything that comes up while we're going through that you want to talk about or kind of, divert to, that's fine. We've got plenty of time, and we're happy to kind of roll with whatever you all are interested in talking about. But the important thing about scope 3 emissions, which is this kind of objective number 2, is we really have to understand that there's kind of scope 1 direct emissions, scope 2 energy related emissions, and then there's like everything else. And for a business or a person or a government, that is where the majority of the impact is going to generally lie. We'll talk about a little bit of data around that. We'll talk about the categories that make up scope 3, and then talk about what to prioritize within scope 3 to make the kind of greatest impact and be efficient. And then kind of throughout, but certainly toward the end as well, we're going to use the interface experience and our history in considering environmental impact from a lot of different angles to try to draw some lessons that hopefully will apply to other businesses, other entities, other organizations. Mikhail, anything to add on that?
No, I think let's charge on into our definitions.
Okay, so these definitions really come from, well, I guess these are kind of unique language to us, but the definitions of scope 1, 2, and 3 are really driven by major kind of greenhouse gas inventory and standard kind of methodologies for understanding where carbon emissions live and how close to a business's activity those things are. So you generally hear it broken down as scope 1, 2, and 3, although yes, there are discussions of farther out scopes. We're not going to get into those today. You're welcome. But scope 1 is about the on-site emissions, which is typically, although not always, but typically due to burning fossil fuels. So we're going to talk about some examples of scope 1 and scope 2, but think of these as your most direct impact, your most kind of immediate emissions. Scope 2 are the emissions associated with all of the energy that your business purchases to operate. So that is, the power plants that run the grid in your area. That is the purchased gas from your gas provider, right? And those things come with a carbon footprint, and that is calculated as your scope 2 emissions.
Just to clarify, purchased gas that you don't burn on site. Anything that gets burned on your behalf is going to be scope 2. If you burn the natural gas on site, it's scope 1.
Right. Okay. Sorry. Thank you. And so both of these emissions are easy to track in the sense that for scope 1, the fuel that you buy and therefore what you consume. Fuel meaning gasoline for cars or your fleets, right? Or natural gas, like Mikhail said, that you burn on site, whether it's for a manufacturing process or whether it's for heat, for example. And then scope 2, you can easily track the emissions that you're responsible for by looking at utility bills. So whether it's the electricity that you've purchased or whether it's something like steam, another commodity that may come from a third party, but obviously takes a lot of energy to produce. Scope 3, and we've intentionally left this to be open because as you'll see, there's a lot to scope 3, is the emissions related to all other company activities. So this is not anything that is not directly controlled by the company, but that your company is responsible for or relies on or influences or causes, right? So we're going to give you some examples of that, but let me start with just a quick kind of scope 1 and 2. So this is on-site natural gas combustion. It's the vehicle emissions. So if your company or your university or your government has a fleet that you own of internal combustion engine vehicles, right? Those emissions are counted as scope 1. And then there's the important kind of additional type of emissions, which would be called process emissions. This is going to be more common for heavy industry or manufacturing, but there are some really important and highly influential process emissions that are worth considering, like in cement or steel production. Now, obviously, we come from the building products industry, so this is kind of where our brain lives, but it's a good example because just in the manufacturing of concrete and cement, the chemical processes of melting rock and aggregating the mixes together in the kind of way upstream before it even gets to the job site. Those things actually do emit carbon dioxide in addition, or methane and similar greenhouse gases, in addition to the emissions associated with the energy that is used to actually make those chemical reactions happen. So process emissions are important to consider, but they're a bit narrow. Like not everybody really has to think about those. Mikhail, anything to add there? Are you good?
No, I mean, anything I would add would just be getting us further in the weeds, and I think we should keep moving.
Okay. Okay, good edit. So scope 2 then. Scope 2 is, as I said, the emissions from purchased energy. And I think that it really is as simple, especially for the purposes of this conversation, to just understand it as what's the carbon footprint of the energy that you buy from your local utility, whatever form that energy comes in. And this is going to be different in different areas of the country with different electrical grids that have more or less renewable energy. You know, in the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of hydropower compared to many other areas of the country. That's a renewable form of electricity that doesn't have the same carbon footprint as coal, which is a dominant kind of source of energy in Georgia, where I live. So, you know, this is variable, but it is pretty simple. Just what are the emissions associated with the energy that you purchase?
Mostly we're talking about electricity there, but it could be, so some places where you buy steam or something, which we do at several of our manufacturing facilities, where someone else has offsite burned something to heat the steam, and what you actually buy is like steam that comes through a tube into your factory. So that becomes directly purchased energy in a different way.
Right.
Or it becomes scope 2 rather than scope 3 because you didn't literally heat the steam on site, you bought it as heated steam.
Right. So I do want to, we're going to return to some data from Interface's, what we call our climate disclosure document, which we can show you if conversation kind of takes us that far along. But these are our tracking of scope 1 and 2 emissions. You'll see there's a difference between gross emissions, net emissions, and then location-based emissions versus market-based emissions. And the difference there is essentially the raw amount of carbon dioxide or equivalent gases that we know is being emitted for the energy that we're consuming or the gas that we're burning. And then the net emissions or the market-based emissions are the kind of accounting for what we have done to purchase green or renewable sources of that energy, which means that the kind of impact is lower than the raw number would lead you to believe. And so the total scope 1 and 2 is basically your net emissions from scope 1 and 2, and that's this 13,000 number down here. If that's not clear, please just let us know in the chat or Q&A. But I don't want to, we're not really here to talk about 1 and 2, but I just wanted to explain why there are 4 lines there instead of 2, basically. And then we're going to talk about the relative impact of scope 1 and 2 versus scope 3 next. So the most important, I mean, it's hard to say that it's really a rule of thumb because it's very general, but scope 3 emissions are almost always the vast majority of an entity, and I'll use that again to try to incorporate company, government, person, any of it. They are the vast majority of the impact of that entity's carbon footprint, right? So this does vary, depends on the sector that you're in or the industry that you're in. It depends on the type of business that you're in, for example. But this is just kind of a graphic representation of scope 1 and 2 versus 3. And if you look at the Interface specific example, you can see it's pretty dramatic. So you just saw the calculation of our net scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is around 13,000 metric tons of greenhouse gases per year. And then the scope 3 emissions, which includes all of our supply chain, is almost 485,000 plus tons. So that's many, many orders of magnitude. I did the math before we started this. That would mean that scope 1 and 2 are around 2.6% of our total company's carbon footprint as compared to, in terms of its total, right?
So the other about 97% is scope 3. So this
Exactly.
is getting to our big point, which is that if you're not dealing with scope 3, you're not really dealing with the carbon impact of your business.
Exactly. And so what does scope 3 include, or where does it come from? These on the left, these are not all, but they are many, and they are the typically the most important um, uh, categories of emissions that fit into scope 3. So this means the carbon emissions associated with anything that you buy or any service that you pay for. So for manufacturers, that means all of our raw materials and the supply chain that we rely on to make the stuff that we sell, that all fits in scope 3. You're going to hear us talk more about this because that is really the most important segment for us to consider as a manufacturer. And again, we're going to try to extrapolate that for the benefit of anybody who doesn't happen to make a product on the call. But it's also going to include the emissions associated with any travel, air or car travel or internal combustion engine travel of your employees for business. And the difference between scope 1 and scope 3 in this case is if your company does not own the cars and is not buying the fuel directly, but you are, for example, reimbursing your salespeople for driving all over the map, that's going to be in your scope 3 impact as opposed to your scope 1, right? Anytime you put a company employee on a plane, that should be considered part of your scope 3 emissions impact as well.
Whereas if you own the plane, it's scope 1.
Yeah, that's right. If you're real fancy. And then there's also elements like, waste disposal. What's the carbon impact of getting rid of material or trash? And then another really important thing to understand is we're all probably looking at a computer screen right now. If that computer is made by Apple or made by Intel or made by Acer or whomever, part of the scope 3 emissions of those companies is actually the energy that we are using right now to run these computers. So that is the use of products that have been sold. And you're going to see when we show you in just a minute our table breakdown of scope 3 categories, that the use phase is also a big kind of sector of scope 3 emissions to consider, but it gets a bit harder to act on because you don't have control. Most companies do not have control of their products after they have been sold, which we may talk more about.
Although we'll talk about this, but for products like a computer that we're using right now that use energy while they are being used, as opposed to, we make flooring, which you might have to expend some energy to vacuum it. That's going to go into our scope 3, but it's really pretty minor compared to an iPhone or a computer that's using energy every second that it's being used. That adds up quickly and becomes a substantial portion of your scope 3. So scope 3, this use of sold products category is super important for a car or an HVAC system or a computer in a way that it wouldn't be for a product that gets produced that just sits there.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Mikhail. And so there's also, and I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about the pictures that you see here in a moment, but the transportation and distribution, both in terms of the raw material goods that you buy or stuff upstream of you in your supply chain and downstream of you. So again, thinking about the computer example, the emissions associated with putting the computers on the trucks or on the boats to get them to where the consumers buy them, that's part of a scope 3 emissions inventory as well. And then these last two categories that are listed here, investments and leased assets and franchises, man, I love these because I think it illustrates just how complicated this gets. But basically what we have to try to account for in scope 3 emissions inventories is if you work with a financial institution and your company has investments, which you do, you have to try to understand what percentage of that financial partner's business do you make up, and therefore what percentage of their carbon footprint are you responsible for? And so this is to me, I think it's a good example. We are not going to talk about investments in leased assets and franchises very much for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is that we don't want to. But the reason that this is complicated is it really relies on excellent data from your partners in terms of their carbon footprint. And even though we're seeing more and more companies, governments, institutions, nonprofits make commitments to inventory and understand their carbon impact and their climate impact, it is still not as ubiquitous as it needs to be to make those types of calculations really easy, right? So it is doable, but it is challenging. So
It's
to
going to
talk,
depend on modeling
go
for a certain amount of scope 3. It's going to depend on modeling. You're going to say on average for this kind of thing, you have this much of it. On average, it's this many kilograms of emissions per dollar. So we're going to assign you this. So it tends to can get pretty inexact the further out you get on this. But the whole idea here is anything that makes you money, that is basically part of how you are in existence as an organization. We need to look at what the carbon impact of that. It's not enough just to give you a free pass on certain ways you make money, say investments. We have to know, like, okay, was that all invested in, coal extraction and burning? We have to assign a carbon value to that if you made money off it.
Yeah, and if you're not a for-profit entity, not just making money but providing service, for example, right? So a charity that like a food pantry, they may have a balance sheet that does not look like a for-profit companies. In fact, I kind of hope that they don't. But the carbon emissions associated with their supply chain still matter. So that means, what is the carbon impact of all of the food that they buy and the supply stream of the food that they then cook, prepare, and give to people. So
we could get really in the
case,
weeds on that one. Let's keep moving.
All right. Well, I'm just saying, but I just think it's important to say it's not just for-profit companies.
Yeah.
So let me just briefly mention these images, right? So the plugs that you see kind of in the top left, those are really to represent the use phase of any product. So we're just trying to reinforce that any electricity that's used to kind of run a product does matter for scope 3. And then the rest of these are a combination of basically the supply chain and then the stuff that comes out of the supply chain, right? So there's actually a carbon impact to buying office paper because it comes from, wood pulp, and most of the time comes from kind of wood pulping and that manufacturing process, right? Or in construction, steel pipes, they have to come out of the ground at some point. And so there's a carbon impact of that. Now let's talk about where to focus. So I mentioned at the very top, the purchased goods and services category is really where you can often find the biggest impact, depending a little bit on the type of company, depending on what you do. So this is just kind of a graphic representation just to give you a rough sense, but it's not a 75-25 split all the time, because you can see in the examples, we have great data from reporting from MasterCard, from the University of Texas at Austin. You have interfaces, and you have Target, like the big retail retailer, and we all have kind of a different amount of our scope 3 emissions that are associated with purchased goods and services, but you can see it's a big chunk in all of those cases. And so to look specifically at the interface example, and I'll remind you that our scope 1 and 2 emissions in total were just over 13,000 metric tons of greenhouse gases, right? The scope 3 emissions is this big 485,000 number. And of that, 240,000 essentially come from just the purchased goods and services. And then capital goods, which is another slightly different category, but it's still purchasing material.
Would be by machines or vehicles or something.
Exactly. Anything that has a depreciation value, I think. That's another 44,000 metric tons. And so that's a really big chunk. Now, you also heard me mention that the use of sold products, and you heard Mikhail highlight this could be really important for certain companies. Even for us, which we make a product that sits on the ground, that's it doing its job, right? Just the cleaning and the maintenance of that material does add up over the life cycle of our product to be 145,000 metric tons, or it looks like maybe a third of our scope 3 emissions, maybe a bit less, right? So I'm going to turn it over to Mikhail. I just saw some Q&A light up, but we're going to talk about where you get information in our industry and start to use our example. But Mikhail, do you want to address these questions quickly?
I think we're going to wait on the question just because it gets us in. Well, I don't know. I didn't see the second one. The first one was pretty deep in the weeds. Actually, I'll address it very quickly. The question from Lacey Lingelbach was, does business travel include the use of energy by the employee on the trip, i.e. their use charging their phone? This is an example of a question where you could go down a deep, dark rabbit hole without really like what you'd want to do with a question like this is quickly size the prize of, is this even worth calculating? Now we can answer this question in a technical way, in that, yes, in order to be in business, all of your employees need to use their computers and their phones, presumably for most companies. That is part of your scope 3 emissions because of that. So yeah, it fits in the same category as the plane ticket because it's not literally something you're emitting. It's not even literally going to show up on your power bill, but it was emitted in service of you being in business. Now the question is kind of what we're digging into now, and we're talking about purchase goods and services, is we need to take action on this yesterday. What matters most? What are the things that are most actionable and biggest? At a certain point, when we're talking about, for instance, business travel and and use of electronic devices and stuff like that, you want to do the easy stuff, which is, for instance, make sure people have the most efficient devices, maybe have the most efficient settings on their devices as a default, which some of the hardware manufacturers are getting better at, some of these, dark mode and other things. And but beyond that, it's probably not big enough to spend a lot of time on it. But technically, yes, it'd be part of your scope 3. How many of these interface scope 3 emissions might also be part of some other entity's emissions inventory? There definitely is opportunity to have overlap in scope 3. Scope 1 and scope 2 are pretty straightforward in terms of that. And this is where I want to highlight something that's pretty important overall point, is that scope 3, we can talk about carbon impact, but we really also have to talk about carbon opportunity. This is your opportunity to make a difference. Your scope 3 is all of the areas that you have influence. This is an area where you are spending money, doing business. You can influence all of these areas. You can influence, vendors you do business with, whether it be for something like air travel or whether it be for, I just saw Netflix's carbon program is amazing. They are moving at warp speed. They fly so many people to production sites that they're actually signing up a deal to use sustainable aviation fuel for some of their travel, which is really a long-term play because sustainable aviation fuel exists, but it's really expensive. So trying to scale it up is challenging, but that's an example of where they are exerting their influence over their scope 3. So it's an opportunity, not just an impact. And yes, you're going to have overlap with some other people's. So your scope, if for instance, if we're selling a product, which we are to different universities, we're in our scope 2, scope 1, and scope 2, and actually a lot of our scope 3 is in your scope 3 emissions. So you have an opportunity to influence someone who you're doing business with to reduce your scope 3 emissions. Maybe we can, if we reduce the amount of energy we use at our factory, we're reducing our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. That's reducing your scope 3 by some amount. But also, if we change what we make the product out of to be in our supply chain, and we reduce our scope 3 emissions by, for instance, changing to a recycled plastic rather than a plastic that has to come from an oil well, going to reduce our scope 3, but it will also reduce your scope 3 from purchase goods and services. So it is all interconnected. And if we think about it as webs of influence and opportunity, not just, if we get into the who's to blame conversation, that gets the lawyers involved and tends to stop progress. So let's think about it as influence and opportunities as we keep score on this stuff. Because if we get into who's to blame, it stops progress.
And Mikhail, we got another question that I think is directly related, but I think we should wait because it's about double counting. And so that's similar to the overlap question, but I think we should wait and talk about it when we get to offsets, because that's a major concern when calculating for offsets. And I think we should address it there.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more specifically because one of the low-hanging fruit for most large organizations, we talked about how important purchase goods and services are. Not all of the purchase goods and services that you purchase that are part of, for most institutions, over half of your overall carbon footprint are easy to quantify. Like we looked at something from the University of Michigan recently where they said, well, we're not going to act on scope 3 because it's too hard to rigorously quantify them. So what we came back with is not for our category. So for building products, there is so much data available for the carbon footprint of making all these products that you can quantify it, you can compare it, and you can reduce it. So you might not be able to do it for every single good and service you buy, but you can certainly do it for building products. And so one of the things we have in building products is we have environmental product declarations. That's the cover page of all these documents, which have the carbon footprint data very rigorously calculated in it. So you can go to the next slide. And so the key thing you're going to get, so this is kind of your carbon footprint, what percentage of the carbon emissions for the life cycle of a product. This, of course, is for carpet tile, which is the number one thing we sell. This is also the interface number, so they're a little skewed over normal. But Joe, if you go to the circle here, this is the number one piece of data you're going to find in an environmental product declaration that you can use and really begin to make purchasing decisions based on, which is what is you can call it cradle to gate. So cradle where the raw materials are born, to gate, the factory gate. So it's not literally it's the actual production phase. So it's from when the raw materials get taken out of the ground or taken from wherever they're taken to when it's ready to ship to the customer. Cradle to gate carbon footprint. You can see for us, and we've done a lot to reduce this, it's still 57% of the whole life cycle footprint. And so that's on the low side for a factory because we're using so much renewable energy. We've done so much on energy efficiency. Even 53% is on the low side for a product like ours because we've done so much to switch to lower footprint materials, to stop using so much material, and to even start to switch to some materials that are made from stored carbon, like bio-based materials from plants that sucked CO2 out of the atmosphere while they were alive, and then we converted them, trying to have as few emissions as possible, into a flooring product. So even we used to be over 80% from that category. So we've come a long way, and yet it's still the vast majority. So this is what you can find in EPD. You can get this idea of, what does the production cycle emit from this product? Because that's going to be it's going to show up in your scope 3 emissions for this product that you purchased. You go to the next slide. So this is just an example. So you can look through an EPD and you can come up with a fun color-coded chart like this of, this is all of if you read all the EPDs, which I did, that was a time I'll never get back. For all US made carpet tile, you can see it's a huge range. It varies from over 20 kilos of pollution that got put in to make the carpet tile to just over 2. So it's almost a factor of 10. So you can see there are some scope 3 reductions available in purchasing carpet tile if that's something you purchase a lot of. But this is what we need to move toward in a lot of other categories, is to figure out where are these reductions available. So you can move on to the next slide. So where we really want to go, and this is where it gets exciting for scope 3, is what if some of what you purchased actually took a chunk out of your scope 3 emissions? So we've actually produced in the last fall the first carbon negative carpet tile. So that cradle to gate, that bar we're talking about, that's all still, can we produce less global warming, to produce a unit of carpet tile? This is the less bad chart. We are less bad, yay. We are helping influence our competitors to become less bad because they want to compete with us. This is where we really want to go. We want to become more good, which what our metric is carbon footprint or carbon emissions. We want to have negative emissions. We want to have net, our supply chain, our production process took some of that excess carbon out of the atmosphere that's doing such a good job trapping excess heat. So we produced one that actually took just over 0.3 kilograms of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to produce it. That's mostly based on using a lot of plant-based rather than fossil-based carbon as our feedstocks to build, product components out of. So this just shows that it's possible. We're working on expanding it. This is actually a comparison against ourselves. You can see sort of our older products are just over 4, which is still industry best. And this is assuming a very low face weight product, because right now we have to not use too much nylon on the carbon negative styles if we want to keep the footprint negative. But you can see, we've proven that it's possible, and now we need to shift the rest of our portfolio toward carbon negative.
Yeah, it's worth, I mean, it may be worthwhile for us to get a little bit more specific about what this means in the context of our product category, but we're going to move forward. And if you all want to come back to understanding better, what's a low carbon footprint carpet tile versus a negative one, how do you calculate it? How does it work? We can certainly get into it. But we're going to move now into, the comparison tools that exist in our sector. And then we'll talk about offsets in a minute.
And so what we've devoted some attention to, unfortunately, a lot of other folks have as well, is to try to figure out how do you nobody wants to do what I did and read 20 EPDs in order to make a single purchasing decision. So we, along with a lot of other folks, starting at the University of Washington Carbon Leadership Forum, but a lot of other folks in the building, design and construction industry. Once people realize what this tool, which is called EC3, or the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator, it reads all the EPDs for you, compares all the EPDs for you, completely automates that process that it took me hours to do of reading all the EPDs and pulling out the one piece of data and figuring out how to put it in a comparable way against other products. So this allows you to set targets. You can say, I know this building project, I'm buying ceiling panels and light gauge steel and gypsum board and carpet. I want to find a reduction based on EPD data in every category. And then the next thing you know, I've got, what you're showing here, that I've got a 59% reduction versus, what would be an average baseline. I got a 59% reduction in the embodied carbon emissions, which is those emissions that we didn't directly emit. They're scope 3 in this conversation, but we're responsible for because we purchased all those, those materials. We're now responsible for that footprint. It's now part of our scope 3. But if you pick the products better based on the data, we just cut that by almost 60%. And most of this is at no additional cost. And that allows us to start keeping score and figuring out, oh, wow, how low could we go? If I start getting some carbon negative products, then I can go really low. And maybe we start to get to net zero embodied carbon, which is the bottom line on this chart. And maybe we even get to the place where we're storing carbon in our materials and storing carbon in our buildings. And that's where we start to become part of the solution to global warming. So check out buildingtransparency.org. Lots of cool resources for this whole conversation of how we turn buildings into a carbon sink, how we start keeping score on this, how we find better products. They've got about 12 product categories up, so it's not every product that someone might be looking for in building design and construction. We also really see this as a model for where procurement, which is, as we discussed, the largest section of scope 3, this is where it needs to go. You can do it for 11 categories of building products right now. We need to be able to do it for every major purchase that every organization is doing to quickly quantify and see if there's better products available, and thus to send a message to these manufacturers who make up so much of your scope 3 emissions, that we're keeping score and we're going to be buying from the people who are doing a better job getting their carbon emissions down, because I'm keeping score on my scope 3, and your category has been identified as an opportunity to reduce my scope 3.
Yep.
Next slide. So in the meantime, as I said, we're all trying to be less bad right now. We have certain products that are higher footprint than others. We only have a few that are carbon negative. We believe that the best policy in the interim is that anything you can't eliminate or reduce, you're still responsible for as the manufacturer. And this is where we'd like to push the conversation. So that's where you get into purchasing of carbon offsets. This is what you do last. And you say, any remaining carbon we still are responsible for. We're going to go invest in carbon reduction or removal projects somewhere else. They have to be stuff that wouldn't have happened otherwise. That's your additionality. And say, okay, we're going to, for any remaining emissions, and we do for the full life cycle. So that includes all the way to end of life. It includes 7 years of running your vacuum over the carpet or mopping the floor.
Every one of these stages, we are accounting for and buying offsets for what we know or what was modeled to be associated with the emissions of that part of the life of the product.
And the other thing that does that's very important is it starts to put a price on carbon, because the trick is, if we're talking about scope 1 and scope 2, those show up on your energy bill. You are paying for that. Maybe it's subsidized, maybe it's lower than it should be, maybe it doesn't account for the true harm caused by, how the energy was generated and the impact on climate or local communities. Scope 3 is totally off the radar. Nobody's paying for those scope 3 emissions. They don't show up on a power bill. They might be in some way embodied in the price you pay for it, but generally not. So what we're saying is that we are going to, if we produce a high footprint product, we're still going to offset for the entire footprint. So if it's 15 rather than 2, we're going to pay, for 13 additional kilos of offsets. And then because we had to pay more for it and we're a for-profit business, we're going to scramble like crazy to try to figure out how do we get that 15 down, so that we don't have to pay so much to produce this, because our policies, we never pass that along, and it always has to be carbon neutral, which means we got to buy offsets. And you still go and you can go to the next slide just to give examples of this. This is, some of our offset project partners. We have to make sure these are good projects, that they're verified to one of these standards, and really some cool things you can provide funding to. But again, this is the last step in the process. But the thing then you can tell is if someone really is, and there's only so many companies doing this, keeping track of, for example, the embodied carbon or their scope 3 emissions from purchased building materials, you can say, you could count that as 0 if you want, if your accounting includes offsets. Now that's an important distinction. Some accounting includes offsets. EPDs, for example, never include offsets. But if you could, or you could report it like we did for our mechanisms, you could say, okay, before offsets, here's the footprint from the purchased building products. After offsets, because we bought from people that already bought carbon offsets, it's actually 0. We just zeroed out that line item in our scope 3 emissions. Now you are going to have to clarify that in your reporting and follow all the GHG reporting, GHG protocol guidelines for that. But it's where we want to go is that if we've already taken responsibility for this, you don't have to even, you can report it as 0, provided the rules for offsets are in place in your reporting.
And I think that this is a good time. There are 2 questions, that one of which I think is going to open up a whole nother line of conversation, which I'm looking forward to, but I want to make sure we do it at the right time, which is the conversation. There's the question about how much more do our carbon negative products cost, or how much more does this cost to produce? Great question. The short answer is it doesn't, and but we have to talk about that because it's really important. But the earlier question about double counting, right? You're absolutely right. It is complicated to think about calculating your company or entity's carbon footprint at scope 3 level, and make sure that you're both being conservative or comprehensive enough, but also not unnecessarily counting multiple emissions at the same time. There's a couple things to understand here, and I'd love Mikhail to chime in for sure. But when we calculate our carbon footprint of the products so that we can sell them carbon neutral, and again, that's every stage of the product's life, right, from upstream to downstream to end of life, and transportation all along the way. What we're doing is using data that comes from our suppliers and the emissions associated with just the production of the material that goes into our product. So it is not like we are offsetting 100% of the scope 1 and 2 emissions of our nylon suppliers, right? We are getting a carbon intensity number for producing a unit of nylon, just like we have the carbon intensity of producing a square of carpet tile, and we are offsetting the equivalent for how much we buy of that nylon. Mikhail, am I right so far?
Yeah.
So that means that we are only accounting for, in our scope 3, just the business that we are doing with that nylon supplier. So even if then that nylon supplier turned around and said, we want to be a carbon neutral company, right? Their calculation, there's definitely going to be overlap, but they're going to calculate their scope 1 and 2 emissions and try to neutralize that out. And there's no harm in that, because neither of us are getting credit for the other person's offsets, right?
Until you end up with a carbon trading scheme where you have to figure out whether there's double counting. Double counting isn't a problem, especially if you're erring on the side of double offsetting. Now, if someone's able to sell a reduction more than once, the same reduction, that's a problem. And so there are scenarios in different carbon trading schemes where you have to be very careful about double counting. Otherwise, someone could sell the same reduction more than once and allow two different people to emit that same amount, in which case we just actually increased carbon emissions. We didn't reduce them.
Right. And we should say that that is exactly the type of problem. It is not the only problem that the verification, I'm going to use the word schemes, but not like devious, but like strategies.
Like European
yeah,
sense
yeah,
of scheme.
like
When
Europeans
Europeans say scheme, it just means like a program.
Exactly.
It's
Sorry.
no pejorative, but in the US, when we say scheme, it sounds nefarious.
Yeah, the verification bodies on the right of this screen here, the gold standard, the verified carbon standard, the California Climate Action Reserve, all those things are designed to make sure that no entity is getting credit for the same reduction, to Mikhail's point, as another company has already claimed, right? So that means that if we preserve 500 acres of forest that was sure to be logged next month, that all of the carbon saved that we've calculated then only goes to one purchaser, as opposed to we now can sell that forestry credit 5 times, because to Mikhail's point, that means that people are getting away with that emissions amount 5 times, which is not the spirit of not the goal, right?
The other important point in that there's a term you'll see is retiring an offset, because theoretically an offset is a fungible, tradable commodity. But if you want to make as soon as you make a carbon neutral claim, you have to retire that offset. You basically take it off the market and say, we took it off the market because we used it up to make a carbon neutral claim. Because until that happens, we could resell it. So if you're talking about retired offsets, that's just part of the process of making a carbon neutral claim. It's kind of a funny thing. For instance, if you have solar panels on your house, you don't necessarily own the claim to that renewable energy if it's just going back on the grid, unless you buy it separately. But as soon as, we've encountered this with factory, on-site generation of renewables. If you want to claim it, it's one thing to have it and be feeding in renewable energy onto the grid. If you want to claim it as renewable energy that you're using, you actually have to buy that attribute. And then you basically retire it. You take it off the market because you purchased and used up, this green energy attribute. It's the same thing for carbon. You have to retire it. You have to take it off the market in order to get credit for it. And that is one of the ways you ensure no double counting. We didn't claim it and then resell it, which would be double counting.
Yeah. I think we can move on. Although I would love to just, if those of you who are on the call are not that familiar with carbon offsets, or you are, and therefore you have more specific questions, like, we're happy to take those. I guess we should say that carbon offsets have always been a temporary strategy for us. We know that the goal is absolute reduction or eventually carbon storage within our product, but that's not viable at this immediate moment. And so we're going to continue to kind of work toward eliminating our use of offsets, but still being a restorative company, still being a carbon negative company. Lacey, you've asked a question here in the chat that I don't exactly understand. So I don't know if Mikhail can and wants to answer it now, but maybe we'll move on and give you an opportunity to just give me a little more context, either in the chat box or in the Q&A, so that we can make sure we answer your question. But Mikhail, if you want to take a stab at it, you can go ahead.
Well, I'll just say for Lacey's question, it gets into the protocols for how life cycle assessment is done, especially when you're talking about calculating scope 3 emissions from a production of a product. The life cycle assessment that is done for that product is going to gather data in very specific, agreed upon ways within life cycle assessment community, which is going to mean you use literal data from a supplier's factory when you have it, and you use accepted, sort of modeled data, which is, for instance, if we don't have, so we know we're putting nylon into a carpet tile. If we don't have data from our nylon supplier who makes yarn for us, because we don't make our own yarn, so it's not going to show up in scope 1 or scope 2 emissions. then we would use a data set, and it's a real data set from, nylon yarn produced in North America, and ideally in a particular region, so you can tell, the blend of the electricity grid, because obviously if it's a more of a coal-fired, grid that you're on, that's going to be a larger emissions to produce that quantity of nylon. So you're going to use either this model data, or more ideal, and this is what we've really sought out and have from most of our tier 1 suppliers. That means, the people we buy directly from, we actually have the data from their specific facility, not just a generic nylon supplier in the right area, so which is literally factory data that someone has gathered and put into one of these databases that you use for life cycle assessment, but it's not likely to be your exact supplier. I don't know if that answered your question, but that is.
Yeah, Lacey, I'll just invite you to, if you need anything further clarified. I'm sorry, I couldn't. I'm glad Mikhail had an idea there, but if you want to add anything to the chat or Q&A, go ahead. I don't think people can unmute themselves, Mikhail, so I think we're down to just answering. But let's talk about SBTI.
Guys.
Oh, hey.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say that actually, if folks want to unmute themselves, they can raise their hands. There's a feature in your bottom panel that says raise hand. So yeah, I will be happy to unmute you if you do that.
Okay, thanks, Christina.
But yeah, Joey, this is an important one. So one of the phenomena we see that is hopefully allowing people to really raise the bar on these scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions calculations. And for a long time, we've had different, especially investors, requiring reporting of emissions, especially scope 1 and scope 2. This is an overall effort by a number of NGOs, which kind of comes together as the Science-Based Targets Initiative, to have companies set much more rigorous goals for at least scope 1 and scope 2, and ideally scope 3, to align with where we need to be in terms of global emissions to keep the climate from warming too much to where we get into a scenario where you're 2 degrees centigrade or above. You start to get into scenarios where it looks like warming leads to more warming. So hotter, drier conditions lead to, more forest fires, which put carbon into the air, which lead to hotter, drier conditions. That's an example of a feed-forward loop, or a self-reinforcing feedback loop, and is not what we want on climate change. We don't want warming to create more warming. And so we have to start to rein in the emissions now if we don't want to go down that, whirlpool. So this is, the great thing to be able to ask if you're starting to look at scope 3 emissions is how many of the people helping generate our scope 3 emissions have science-based targets. So in terms of major vendors and partners, if you want to reduce your scope 3 and your major vendors don't have science-based targets to reduce at least their scope 1 and scope 2, you're going to have trouble reducing your scope 3 as long as you're in business with them. So you can see SBTI is a whole bunch of different groups coming together around alignment around what are acceptable targets. Companies will go in and submit, like, here's our science-based target. We're going to reduce this much in scope 1, this much in scope 2, this much in scope 3, each one with a very pretty near-term due date of by when you will do that. But then this group of experts has to approve it as actually being a sufficient science-based target to really be in line with what we're trying to do globally. And so it's going to be based on what your business is and what your total emissions are. But again, trying to round it out into what's best for the planet rather than just what the company thinks they can pull off, without, too much struggle. So we just announced and got approved a science-based target, which is, in line with Interface's historical goal setting, which is we set a goal we have no idea how to reach and then innovate. Because I look at these numbers and I'm like, whoo, okay. Gonna have to question some fundamental assumptions and do some serious changes, because we just committed. We had already reduced our greenhouse gas intensity by 96% from 1996 to 2019. And then we just announced that, that's for scope 1 and scope 2. We just announced that we were, between 2019 and 2030, we were going to reduce those scope 1 and scope 2, which we already reduced by 96%, by an additional 50%. So we're going to have to go in our supply chain, and our direct factory, impact, actually not supply chain in this case, and find 50% more to squeeze out. So that should be an interesting challenge. And then we made a couple of specific scope 3 commitments to, again, reduce scope 3 from purchased goods and services 50%. For us, it's far and away most of our scope 3. But then we also wanted a way to engage with a lot of other employees. And so we also set a specific goal around reducing business travel and employee commuting footprint in scope 3 by 30%. That was really more of an employee engagement thing, not because it was the biggest single thing. Purchased goods and services is far and away the big thing. That's why we set a goal, an aggressive goal on that. Business travel and commuting is more of like, how do we get everyone involved?
Right. And again, that would be, and this is important. Maybe we'll get into this now, like thinking about the context for other companies. For Interface as a manufacturer, the majority of our scope 3, as we've said many times in this presentation already, is about that purchased goods from the supply chain, right? But if you're, for example, a professional services organization like an Ernst & Young, like EY or Accenture or
Deloitte,
Deloitte, yeah, or we're an insurance company, like Lloyd's or whatever. Any of those companies, the employee commuting and the business travel is actually going to be a much bigger proportion of their scope 3 impact, because they just don't buy the material, the physical stuff that we do as a manufacturer. And so
the other big one I'll call in that area is because so many companies are, especially in the tech space, so many of their emissions come from data centers, which if you own them, that's scope 1 and scope 2. If you don't own your data center, which a lot of people don't, they're depending on Amazon Web Services or whoever, that's a scope 3, but it could be a huge portion of your scope 3, a huge portion of your overall, carbon impact to your business, because you're using Amazon or whoever's web services.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. So, the SBTI really, if it's pushing an organization like us, it is pushing most organizations, a lot. And I think it's a really good sign, because we say all the time, and I'm sure you've heard all the time, where we are right now with climate change, we got to move fast and we got to go far, and we don't have that long to do it. And so these are the types of reduction numbers, no matter how hard or scary they may seem, even again, for a company that like ours, and I'm not trying to be boastful, but just, we've done a lot of this work. There's, to Mikhail's point, it's not as simple as going to pay, $2 every megawatt or something for green power anymore. We've done that stuff. So it's going to take some more creativity. But this is, as you can see from that bottom line, in line with what science tells us a company of our size and our emissions needs to do to help the world stay on track for a warming of no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which, by the way, is still not good, right? But it's not as disastrous as it could be. So
it's kind of the minimum we need to do. But our company mission is to reverse global warming. It's entirely possible, if you scaled up all these things that reduce emissions or that capture additional carbon from the atmosphere, we could reduce them, and we could pick how much carbon we want to have in the atmosphere. If we scale up these things that can allow us to draw down or pull down CO2 from the environment, or just to allow natural systems to pull that stuff down and not swamp them with all of this fossil carbon from burning oil and gas and coal. Totally technically doable, but we have to start doing better accounting, set better goals. The other thing I'll point out here is that when we talk about innovation, it's not just like, oh, we got to get some new fancy carbon removal technology. So much of the innovation, and it goes to that first question that someone asked, or one of the questions, which is like, how much more is your product going to cost because of that? We're in a highly competitive, commoditized category. We can't charge more for our product, and that's going to result in lower sales. So we have to figure out, the innovation in sustainable business is to figure out how you make the business decision, the economically best decision, the same as the sustainable best decision. In this case, the low carbon decision. That requires some crazy supply chain innovation where we identify, oh, here's a cool, carbon storing ingredient we could use in our product, and it costs so much more than we could ever afford. This ingredient we use, that I think the pricing we found for it is for cosmetics. And it's so, how much for an ounce of it? Well, we need like 600 tons. We're never going to be able to put that in our product if it's priced by the ounce. So we had to figure out, how do we get a similar, lower cost version of that ingredient produced at a price we can actually afford? It's great that someone figured out how to produce it. Now we need to figure out how to produce it in an economically feasible way. And that's where so much of the innovation has to happen. It's not going to be a trade-off. It's not going to be, oh, our business is just going to suck and we'll meet our carbon goals. That's not going to work. We're a publicly traded company. We have to be profitable.
Yeah. Sorry, Mikhail, I didn't mean to switch slides on it. It just clicked there. But let's get out of the slide deck here and get back into that. I think we should maybe wrap up with our discussion of exactly that point. Like, how do you make this make business sense? So the resource documents that we are going to get are actually not interface documents. You're welcome. They are from a group called the Carbon Leadership Forum, which is an academic body out of the University of Washington that really has provided some leadership on how any really it is still building portfolio owner, but obviously that's agnostic of sector or role, right? That could be a major university, it could be a big company, it could be a government, it could be a municipality, and provide some strategies for reducing your carbon impact. This is also an IUPUI slide, so thank you, McKinney Family Foundation. And that's, I'm just going to leave this up for a moment or two. If you want our email addresses, you're welcome to reach out to us. But I want to stress what Mikhail was just talking about with the cost issue. I think the difference between Interface's approach to sustainability and innovation in this space and most other companies, I'm not going to say all, and I'm not going to limit it even just to our sector or competitors, because it's not the point. The difference is that we have a purpose, an environmental purpose that we pursue while as, and in fact by, pursuing a more successful business strategy. And that purpose is, as Mikhail said, reversing global warming. And most companies, when they think about their green products or their environmental action, it is to be more relevant to a particular market or community. It is to sell more of a certain type of green product, but the fundamental purpose, mission, goal, idea behind their business has not changed. They just want to be a more and more financially successful entity. And
maybe
I think
reduce financial risk or some other things like that.
Yeah, and we have proven that unlimited profit motive without consideration of the fact that we live on a finite planet is literally unsustainable. The earth cannot handle that motivation. And so we need to challenge business to not ask consumers to pay 20% more for doing the right thing, and not take a loss for doing the right thing and turn every business into a charity, but combine those two goals and make sure that you remain as relevant, as competitive, as a thriving financial institution as you've ever been, while also providing value back to the ecosystems that we rely on to survive.
As Ray Anderson, our founder, liked to say, our goal is to make a bigger, better profit.
Yeah, I was just trying to get you to say that. So I see another thing in the Q&A. Maybe open, here we go. Single most impactful decision to reduce Scope 3 emissions. Well, my answer a little bit is it depends on what sector you're in, but I think focusing on the carbon impact of whatever it is that you purchase is the best place to start. And for a major, portfolio owner, if you have a lot of real estate, focusing on building products is actually a really good place to start because the data is there. That's what our industry kind of weirdly has in spades. Not just the carpet tile or flooring sector or product category, but really building products in general. So I think that's really important. And one way to do that, even in the absence of using environmental product declarations, for example, is to just be asking your suppliers and your partners about their carbon footprint, about their carbon story. The
about
more
their carbon goals. So ask about science-based targets. If they don't have those, do they have any kind of a climate target? Yeah. But again, the thing to understand is that your opportunity and your carbon footprint in Scope 3 are going to be mapped very closely together. There are certain things like the amount of work done in building products to quantify and create credible, field of data for the different products, that's going to make that a more low-hanging fruit. But anywhere that you spend a lot of money on purchased goods and services is where you have the leverage, because you're a big customer, to really dig in and change and reduce within that category. So it may mean you switch vendors. It may mean you go on an innovation journey with one of your vendors to where they reduce their footprint. That's what we've had to do with our component vendors. Is we have had several vendors where we have given them more of our business in exchange for them making promises on environmental, especially greenhouse gas reductions, but other benefits that they're going to change in their process in exchange for us becoming, not just staying their customer, but actually becoming a bigger customer in some cases.
Yeah, thanks. So Christina, you let me know somebody's got their hand raised. So go ahead if you're ready to unmute somebody for us.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah,
I just want to make sure okay.
Welcome.
Hi, thank you. My name is Nakama. I'm a sustainability analyst at Karamita. So thank you so much for this really enlightening discussion. I just had a kind of a broader question, but so we talked a lot about on the call, I feel like about, the economic case for being sustainable, but the truth is that going after profit is what got us into the climate crisis in the first place. It's exactly why we're here, is that big overall theme of like people who just cared about money and consistently put profit over people. And I'm not necessarily against that mindset, but I do think that there might not be enough like weight or pushback to this idea that we shouldn't only be talking about profit. And how can we expect corporations which have only ever cared about profit and shareholders, that they're suddenly going to turn around and care about us? And we see that all the time in greenwashing and kind of like what you said, these like super unambitious fake climate goals. I don't fully understand why we consistently have to be like harping on this profit when like that's exactly why we're in this problem in the first place.
That is a more fundamental question.
For sure.
I think getting carbon emissions on the balance sheet and getting them considered in economic decision making is probably a transitional strategy. I think what you're getting to is more of a values-based discussion. And that is really probably the more fundamental thing that has to change is, the economic system as it's set up does not incorporate some of our most deeply held values. And so there's probably some more fundamental change that needs to happen as a transitional strategy, because that is how decisions are being made based on these economic indicators. We need to make sure that some of our values are valued in the economic system. Until we can more fundamentally change the economic system to better reflect our values, we need to make sure that we have, there is no price on carbon. It's not on the balance sheet for most things. The interesting thing you see with all these companies committing to net zero or carbon neutral is that they will have to spend some money to achieve that. It's starting to just begin to trickle onto the balance sheet. Not enough and not commensurate.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just lost Mikhail. Can you hear me, Mikhail?
No, we can't hear Mikhail.
I would also say
okay. Thank you, Christina. But try again, Mikhail. I just
Can you hear me now? I just muted it.
Yeah, I got you. The last word I heard.
Oh, it's telling me my internet connection is unstable. I actually wonder if power company is cutting off my power.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
because we just had some global warming related flooding.
I can explain. Hopefully Mikhail can hang with us. I do have a quick response for you, Nahama. I think you should have a problem with the mindset of pure profit motive for sure. I think Mikhail and I both do. I know I do. I think that the challenge is not to see this as an either or, but to figure out figure out how to be financially successful. And that doesn't mean unlimited profit necessarily, right? That doesn't mean the same metrics that we have applied to financial or business success in the past. But it also means that we need commerce. We need business. And even if we don't need business and commerce in a future utopia, we're nowhere close to eliminating business and commerce now. So the way that I like to think about it, and I would love your response to this, is actually something that Ray Anderson, again, our founder, said, which was the only institution, and he was not the only person, this isn't necessarily his idea, but he became kind of famous for saying it, the only institution on the face of the planet that is pervasive enough and powerful enough to avert environmental catastrophe is ironically the same one that is most responsible for causing environmental catastrophe, which is business. So we can't give up on the levers of business and expect the planet, or really more like our species, the planet's going to be fine. It's a lot older than us. It will continue to, live on much longer than we survive. But if we want to keep inhabiting this planet and we want it to be pleasant, then we have to find a way to transform business into a force for a positive future, not just a force for generating profit. And I think that's the civilizational challenge I think that we face in this next couple decades. And I think it's possible, but it's going to take creativity, and it's going to take bravery, and it's going to take some new models and paradigms, which are going to require exactly, people like you asking exactly that question. So I don't know if you're still there or can still speak, but if I don't know if you have a response to those things, or if anybody else wants to chime in.
Well, it's just interesting because I'm reading this book by Naomi Klein called This Changes Everything. And she actually kind of says the exact opposite of what you just said, that we've tried using she says I guess the one of the underlying themes of the book, the theme of the book is how capitalism is actually destroying the climate. I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but
I would.
The whole theme, my take wouldn't necessarily go that far. That's what her take is. But I think the whole book kind of points to the fact that we've only ever relied on capitalism in the past to solve the climate crisis, and it's continuously failed us. So I think it's interesting that you bring up that point. I feel like as a people, we haven't necessarily seen that much proof of that yet, of what you were saying. I don't think the people who are currently destroying the planet are doing that much.
No, I agree with you. No, I have no argument with any of those things. And Mikhail's not going to let me go too far off the rails here, so I'm not going to go too much longer on this. But I am not trying to say that capitalism is going to save us. I'm trying to say we have to figure out a way to change economic incentive to align with environmental health and human health and equity and well-being. And I would say Naomi Klein, who I have read as well, would say that that's not a capitalist model. She's probably right, but let's just take that off the table. It doesn't really matter. Just whatever we do for economic growth or economic stability, which is probably a better thing to go for, we have to find, and it is not going to be led by the same minds and the people who look like me and Mikhail that have led us to where we're at. And it's not going to have the same ideas. It's not going to have the same companies. It's not going to have the same motives, but we can't abandon looking at business or looking at commerce, which is not the same as looking at capitalism, as a lever for massive change, because it has been proven over generations that business has a substantial, the most substantial impact. Mikhail, we can still see you moving and typing, so I think you're probably good to speak.
Okay, yeah, I'd put it in the chat, but the Donut Economics is another great book on this in terms of how do we bring in these sort of forgotten societal values into the economic system that are not well reflected in the current system. But yeah, I think you raise a great point, Nechama. There's a larger change. I think a lot of what we're talking about right now are transitional strategies. It's about, we've got to get there from here, and we are in a capitalist system now. One of the things I'm most excited about sometimes is that we can do things within the current system that will make the current system less damaging. We may or may not be able to get there all the way there from inside the current system. But the thing I think is exciting is if you can make enough people through the course of changing the details of the current system have to think about this stuff, it's going to change some minds. and which is going to lead to the more fundamental change. Because fundamentally, what has to change is the way people think about this and what they value and how they thus implement that within society. And so if we get people having to think about climate change in every decision they make, maybe it makes them question, some more fundamental things about what our assumptions in society. And that might be the most important work of all.
Thank you so much. And I'll definitely take a look at the book. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Great one. Christina, I didn't see anybody else with a hand raised, and the Q&A is quiet, but you have anything else for us or anything you wanted us to address that you were curious about?
No, I just wanted to say that this has been an absolutely fascinating and enlightening discussion, especially at the tail end. Like the topics that Nihama brought up are really important as we have this discussion of our scope 3 emissions. So I think that's a great way to wrap up. I just want to thank both Joey and Mikhail for this awesome presentation. Thank all of our audience for their thoughtful questions. And unless there are any final questions, and I don't think there are, our attendees can just take a brief break. And when the program resumes at 4 o'clock, you may head back to Remo, where we will have networking on our expo hall and eventually closing remarks. But thank you again, Joey and Mikhail.
Ooh, real people.
Real people. You are both welcome to come too.
I'll just pop right over.
Yeah. Thanks, Christina. All right. Y'all have
Thanks,
a great
everyone.
day. Appreciate the time.
Thank you all. Bye.